The diplomatic station hung in orbit like a silent metal city above the pale blue planet below. From a distance, it looked calm and almost beautiful, like a glowing ring resting in the darkness of space. Inside, however, every corridor, every chamber, and every guarded hall carried the weight of tension. This was not a place of comfort. It was a place where different worlds came together with careful words and hidden fears. On this day, a high-ranking alien envoy was arriving for critical negotiations. Her species was known across the systems for their intelligence, discipline, and political influence. She had attended dozens of interstellar meetings before on many worlds and stations, but she had never been assigned human protection until now. That alone had already made her curious and slightly irritated. Humans were still seen by many species as newcomers, not weak exactly, but untested in the larger scale of galactic politics. Their homeworld was often described in reports as a Deathworld, a planet with extreme conditions, dangerous wildlife, unstable climates, and constant survival pressure. Most species believed such an environment would limit technological refinement or diplomatic subtlety. Others believed it had made humans unpredictable. The envoy did not fully agree with either opinion. She preferred facts over rumors. Still, when she learned her assigned bodyguard would be human, she had expected someone impressive in appearance or reputation. Instead, she was told very little. The docking bay doors opened with a slow mechanical hum. A delegation of station officers stood in formal rows, their uniforms crisp and their movements perfectly synchronized. The envoy stepped forward with calm precision, her long ceremonial attire flowing slightly with each step. Her presence alone made nearby assistants straighten their posture. She was used to that effect. Authority often spoke before words did. And then she saw him. The human bodyguard stood slightly apart from the rest, not in a position of attention like the others, but in a position of awareness. His posture was relaxed, yet somehow alert in a way that was hard to define. He was not large compared to some species present, nor did he carry any visible heavy armor. His equipment was standard, functional, practical, unremarkable. There was nothing about him that demanded attention. And yet, something about him made the envoy pause for half a second longer than she intended. He did not stare at her like the others did. He did not show fascination or nervousness. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the environment, scanning exits, corners, reflections on metal surfaces, and even the spacing between people. It was not paranoia. It was routine. One of the station officers introduced him briefly. His name was not important in this assignment file, only his role. Assigned protection detail. Full-time escort. Emergency response trained. Combat experienced. The envoy nodded politely, though her expression revealed nothing. Understood, she said in a calm tone. The human gave a slight nod in return. No extra words. No unnecessary gesture. Just acknowledgement. That too was noted by her. As they moved through the station corridors, the envoy observed everything carefully. She noticed how different species reacted to her presence. Some bowed slightly. Others avoided eye contact. A few whispered in their native tongues when they believed she could not understand. But she understood more than they thought. One group of delegates from a reptilian species muttered something about humans being overplaced as guards. Another suggested that assigning a human to protect an envoy of her rank was either an insult or a political joke. She did not react. Reaction was a form of participation, and she preferred observation first. The human bodyguard, however, reacted in a different way, or rather, did not react at all. He continued walking beside her at a steady pace, slightly behind her left side. Always the same distance. Always the same angle. It was subtle, but she noticed it quickly. It was not random. It was calculated positioning. Every time they turned a corner, he adjusted. Every time another individual approached, his body shifted just slightly to maintain coverage of her blind spots. Even when nothing seemed threatening, his attention never fully relaxed. The envoy had seen professional guards before. She had even worked with elite security from multiple systems. But this was different. There was no visible tension in him. No emotional strain. No sign of effort. It was as if this level of awareness was not something he had to maintain, but something that simply existed within him. Still, she did not comment. They entered the main diplomatic corridor, a wide passage lined with transparent panels showing the stars outside. The station rotated slowly, creating a controlled artificial gravity that felt almost natural. Delegates from various species were already gathering near the conference chamber doors. The Envoy's arrival caused a noticeable shift in atmosphere. Conversations lowered, movements slowed, attention focused. She was expected. As she approached, the human bodyguard stayed close, slightly behind her right shoulder now, adjusting to the flow of people entering from the opposite side. His eyes continued to move, never resting on one point for too long. A tall alien delegate stepped forward to greet her. His tone was polite, but there was a sharp edge underneath the words. Formal respect, but not genuine warmth. "The Council appreciates your arrival," he said. She responded with equal formality. "I am here to ensure clarity in communication between our systems." Behind her, she could sense the human shifting his stance slightly. Not aggressive, just prepared. More delegates arrived. The chamber slowly filled. The air grew heavier with unspoken tension. This was not unusual. Diplomatic meetings between different species often carried underlying competition, even when cooperation was the stated goal. The envoy took her designated position near the center of the chamber. The human bodyguard remained a few steps behind her, positioned near a structural pillar that gave him a clear view of nearly the entire room. It was not random either. It was strategic placement. She noticed this again. Nearby, two alien officials continued their conversation in low tones, assuming privacy due to language differences. But translation systems on the station were advanced enough to pick up most speech patterns. "They assigned a human as her protector," one said. "Strange choice," the other replied. "They are still inexperienced in large-scale diplomacy." The first gave a soft, dismissive sound. "Perhaps it is symbolic. A gesture of unity rather than capability." The envoy heard it clearly, but again, she did not respond. She simply looked forward, maintaining her composed posture. Still, she found herself briefly glancing back toward the human. He did not appear offended. He did not appear concerned. If anything, he looked like someone who had heard similar comments many times before. And that, more than anything else, stayed in her mind. Because experience leaves patterns. And she was beginning to notice a pattern she could not easily explain. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the official session was about to begin. A soft mechanical tone echoed through the space, signaling final preparations. Doors sealed. Security protocols engaged. All external access locked. The envoy adjusted her stance slightly, preparing mentally for long negotiations ahead. Behind her, the human bodyguard took one small step closer. Not invasive, not noticeable to most, but enough to ensure he could reach her within a fraction of a second if needed. She did not yet know why, but she was beginning to understand something important. This was not an ordinary assignment. And this human was not an ordinary protector. But before she could explore that thought further, the first official words of the meeting were about to be spoken. The diplomatic chamber slowly settled into silence as the final security tones faded through the station. Thick doors sealed shut with a deep mechanical sound, and the soft hum of energy fields confirmed that no one could enter or leave without authorization. Inside, dozens of species sat or stood in carefully arranged positions, each one representing different worlds, different beliefs, and different levels of influence across the system. At the center of it all stood the alien envoy. She remained composed, her posture calm and steady, as if nothing in the room could disturb her focus. That was expected of her position. She had spent years learning how to hide reaction behind discipline. In diplomacy, emotion was often a weakness that others tried to exploit. Behind her, a few steps back and slightly to the side, the human bodyguard maintained his position. He had not spoken since they entered the chamber. He had not moved unnecessarily. But he had not relaxed either. The envoy could feel it now more clearly than before. It was not nervousness. It was something else. Something structured. like a constant awareness that never switched off. Around the room, conversation began again in low voices as officials settled into negotiations. Data screens lit up across the chamber walls, displaying translated terms, treaties, and disputed territory maps. The meeting had officially begun. A senior delegate from a heavily armored species rose first. His voice carried through the chamber with authority, though there was a faint undertone of challenge. "We acknowledge the presence of the Envoy and her supporting delegation," he said. "However, we must question the current balance of representation." Several heads turned slightly. This was not an unusual opening. Diplomacy often began with subtle testing. The Envoy responded without hesitation. "Representation follows agreed protocol," she said. "We are here to continue discussions already established in previous sessions." Her tone was calm, controlled, and firm. The delegate leaned forward slightly. "Protocol evolves. Power shifts. New variables must be accounted for." The room grew a little more tense. This was not yet conflict, but it was the beginning of pressure. Behind her, the human bodyguard shifted his weight slightly. Not forward, not backward, just a small adjustment to maintain line of sight across multiple angles in the room. The Envoy noticed it again. He was always aware of positioning, always adjusting without drawing attention. It was almost invisible behavior, yet it never stopped. Another delegate, smaller in size and more slender in appearance, spoke next. His tone carried a sharper edge. "We have reviewed recent human involvement in security roles," he said. "There are concerns regarding suitability in high-level diplomatic environments." A few subtle reactions followed across the room. Some agreement, some skepticism, some curiosity. The Envoy did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the pattern. This was not just a comment about the human bodyguard. It was a broader attempt to test human standing in the negotiation space. Still, before she could answer, the human spoke for the first time. Not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly. "Suitability is measured by performance under pressure," he said. The room shifted slightly. Attention moved toward him, though he did not step forward. He continued, "Not perception." Silence followed for a brief moment. The Envoy turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him speak. It was the first time he had entered the conversation without being addressed directly. And yet, his tone carried no arrogance, no challenge, just fact. The armored delegate narrowed his eyes slightly. "And what would you know about pressure?" The human did not react immediately. Instead, his eyes scanned the room once more. A slow, practiced movement. He was not looking at the speaker alone. He was checking exits, angles, distance between individuals, the positioning of guards stationed along the upper platforms. Then he answered, "Enough." One word. That was all. But the way he said it caused a subtle change in the room's atmosphere. Not fear, not respect yet. Something closer to recalibration. The Envoy noticed it clearly now. The others were beginning to reassess him. Not because of his words alone, but because of how he carried them. The conversation in the chamber moved forward. Data was presented. Territorial disputes were reviewed. Economic exchange routes were debated. The Envoy spoke when necessary, always precise, always controlled. But the tension did not leave the room. It only shifted. At intervals, the Envoy became aware of small reactions from other delegates when they looked toward the human. Some whispered. Some observed longer than necessary. Some pretended not to notice him at all. And yet, he remained unchanged. Still, silent, but not passive. As discussions continued, a sudden interruption came from the upper section of the chamber. A technician's voice echoed through the communication system. "External signal interference detected. Source unknown." The room paused. Every head turned slightly upward. The Envoy felt a subtle tightening in the atmosphere. Security alerts on diplomatic stations were not rare, but they were usually controlled quickly. The fact that it was announced publicly meant something was wrong with the usual systems. The human bodyguard moved immediately. Not dramatically, Not visibly urgent. Just a shift in posture that placed him slightly closer to the envoy's direct line. His eyes scanned upward toward the ceiling panels, then across the chamber doors, then to the far side exits. It happened so fast that most did not notice. But the envoy did. She saw it clearly now. He was not reacting to the announcement. He had already begun analyzing before the announcement finished. Another voice came through the system. Minor breach in external communication buffer. Investigating. A few delegates exchanged uneasy looks. Others remained calm, but their posture changed slightly. Hands moved closer to consoles. Security personnel along the walls adjusted their stance. Still, no visible threat had entered the chamber. But the atmosphere was no longer stable. The envoy finally spoke again, keeping her tone steady. Is there a risk to internal security? Pause followed. Then the reply came. No confirmed breach inside the chamber. The room relaxed slightly, but the human did not relax. That difference was subtle but important. He took one small step forward now, placing himself more directly between the envoy and the main access corridor behind her. The envoy noticed it immediately. You believe there is a threat, she said quietly, without turning fully toward him. It was not a question. It was an observation. The human did not look at her when he replied. I believe there is incomplete information, he said. That answer carried weight. Not fear, not certainty, but readiness. The envoy studied him for a moment longer. She had dealt with many types of guards. Some were overly aggressive. Some were overly cautious. Some relied entirely on technology and systems. But this one was different. He relied on something harder to define. Experience that was not visible in records. The chamber lights flickered briefly. A small disruption, almost unnoticeable, but enough for several security officers to react instantly. That was when the human moved his hand slightly, not toward a weapon, but toward positioning, placing himself at an angle that allowed full visibility of both the envoy and the nearest exit point simultaneously. The envoy felt a shift in the room that others had not yet fully registered. Something was building, not confirmed, not visible, but present. And for the first time since arriving, she understood why humans were assigned to roles like this despite the skepticism of other species. It was not about appearance. It was not about technology. It was about response under uncertainty. And uncertainty was exactly what the chamber now felt like. The armored delegate from earlier spoke again, but his tone had changed slightly. Security protocols are sufficient. There is no need for unnecessary alarm. As he finished speaking, the chamber doors at the far end made a soft, almost unnoticeable sound. A mechanical click that did not match normal cycle timing. The human bodyguard heard it. Before anyone else reacted, his eyes shifted toward that direction. And the room, still unaware of what was about to unfold, continued speaking as if everything was under control. The chamber was still speaking, but the feeling inside it had already changed. At first, it was subtle. A small shift in the air like pressure building behind sealed metal doors. Conversations continued. Screens kept updating data, and officials still debated terms of trade and territorial balance. But beneath all of that, something no one could fully explain was starting to form. The human bodyguard noticed it first. Not because he was told. Not because of alarms. But because the environment itself no longer felt stable in the way trained experience learns to recognize. He did not move quickly. He did not draw attention. Instead, he simply adjusted his stance, shifting his weight slightly so that his body was now aligned more directly with the envoy and the main entrance corridor. His eyes moved again, slower this time, scanning the ceiling panels, the floor seams, and the reflection patterns on the polished metal walls. The envoy noticed his behavior immediately. It was different now. Before, he had been observant, careful, controlled. Now he was focused. The kind of focus that comes when something is no longer theory, but possibility. She followed his line of attention for a brief moment, but saw nothing unusual. The chamber looked the same as before. Delegates were still seated. Security units were still positioned along the walls. The station systems still showed green status indicators. Yet the human did not relax. That alone made her attention sharpen. Across the chamber, a low vibration passed through the floor. It was so faint that most beings did not react. A few assumed it was part of the station's normal rotation adjustment. Others did not notice at all. But the human did. His fingers tightened slightly, not around any weapon, but in a natural reflex that suggested readiness. Then came the sound. A soft mechanical click from the far side of the chamber doors. It was not loud. It was not alarming. But it did not belong. The doors were supposed to remain sealed under diplomatic protocol. No manual override was scheduled. No authorized entry was expected. The human bodyguard turned his head slightly toward the sound. And in that moment, everything changed. The chamber doors did not open normally. Instead, there was a pause, a hesitation in the system, then a second click, followed by a soft hiss that did not match controlled pressure release. The human moved, not in panic, not in haste, in decision. He took one step forward and slightly to the side, placing himself fully between the Envoy and the direction of the sound. His body was now no longer passive protection in the background. It was a barrier. The Envoy finally reacted. "What is happening?" she asked quietly, her voice still controlled, but now carrying a sharper edge. The human did not look at her. "Unknown entry attempt," he said. His tone was calm, but every part of his posture had changed. The chamber lights flickered again. This time, longer. A few delegates paused their conversations. Then a second flicker followed. And that was when the alarm finally sounded. Not a loud emergency siren, but a diplomatic alert tone. A signal that something inside a restricted security environment was no longer within normal parameters. Immediately, the chamber responded. Security personnel along the walls turned toward the main doors. Some raised their communication devices. Others activated defensive protocols. The room, once full of controlled discussion, shifted into coordinated uncertainty. The armored delegate from earlier stood up quickly. "This is unacceptable," he said loudly. "Explain this breach immediately." But no immediate explanation came, because the doors were now opening. Slowly, not fully forced, but not authorized either. The opening was uneven, as if the system was being overridden from multiple conflicting inputs at once. The Envoy felt a slight tension rise in her chest. Not fear exactly, but awareness that something had just crossed from possibility into reality. The human bodyguard did not take his eyes off the doors. Now she understood what focus meant. It was not distraction from everything else. It was the removal of everything unnecessary. The doors finally opened halfway, and what entered was not immediately clear. At first, it looked like maintenance personnel, figures in neutral station uniforms. But something was wrong with their movement. Too synchronized, too deliberate, like they were following a shared pattern rather than individual thought. The human shifted slightly again, just a small adjustment. But now his feet were planted firmly, as if preparing for impact rather than observation. The Envoy noticed something else. The security personnel in the chamber hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. That hesitation was enough, because whatever had entered the room was already moving. Fast, not chaotic, controlled. The first figure stepped fully into the chamber and raised an arm. Not a weapon immediately visible, but something compact and unknown. That was enough. The human bodyguard reacted instantly. He moved forward in a single motion that was not dramatic but extremely precise. His body crossed the distance between him and the nearest line of approach in less than a heartbeat. Before most could process what was happening, he reached the attacker. There was no hesitation, no warning, just interruption. The attacker's arm was redirected before it could fully align. The object in their hand was forced off trajectory. The human did not rely on strength alone. It was timing, positioning, and control of movement. The Envoy saw it, but only in fragments. A shift, a step, a sudden change in direction. Then the attacker was no longer where they were supposed to be. A second figure entered behind the first. Then a third. The chamber was no longer just a meeting space. It was becoming a contested environment. Security personnel finally reacted fully, moving to intercept. But their coordination lagged by seconds. Not due to lack of training, but due to unexpected entry patterns that did not match standard threat models. The human did not wait for coordination. He adapted immediately. Each movement he made was efficient, not wasted. He did not chase. He intercepted. He redirected paths instead of engaging directly where unnecessary. The Envoy, still standing at the center, felt the situation shift around her like a storm forming too close to remain calm. Yet something struck her even in that chaos. The human was not reacting like someone surprised. He was reacting like someone who had seen similar situations before. Different place, different scale, but same structure. Threat enters. Time shortens. Decisions become immediate. One of the attackers managed to break past initial interception lines and moved toward the Envoy's position. For the first time, the human raised his voice. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut through noise. Stay behind me. It was not a request. It was instruction. The Envoy did not question it. She moved a half step back without thinking. That alone surprised her later, because she did not usually follow instructions without evaluation. But something in his tone removed hesitation. The attacker advanced again. The human closed the gap instantly. What followed was not described in dramatic motion. It was too fast for most observers to fully track. But the result was clear. The attacker was no longer advancing. Around the chamber, confusion was turning into controlled response. Security forces finally coordinated in groups, sealing exits, isolating zones, and stabilizing the environment. But the human remained at the center of action near the Envoy, always between her and uncertainty, always adjusting, always aware. More attackers entered, but their advantage was already weakening. The initial disruption had failed to create full control. Now it was becoming containment rather than takeover. The Envoy, still behind him, finally saw something she had not expected to see so clearly. Despite everything happening, despite movement, noise, and danger, the human's breathing remained steady, not rushed, not uneven, controlled, as if the environment itself had not yet reached his limit. And in that moment, as the chamber filled with alarms, shifting lights, and coordinated response teams, one realization began forming in the Envoy's mind. This was not a guard placed for ceremony. This was a guard placed for survival scenarios that most diplomatic stations never even admitted could happen. And whatever was unfolding now was only the beginning of understanding why. The chamber was no longer a place of discussion. It had become a place of survival. The sudden intrusion had changed everything in seconds, but what came after was even more important than the breach itself. It was how quickly the people inside adapted or failed to adapt to something that was never supposed to happen in a diplomatic environment. The human bodyguard stood at the center of that change. Now fully engaged, he moved with controlled precision, staying between the Envoy and any shifting threat angle. The attackers were no longer advancing in a clear formation. Their entry had been disrupted. Their coordination was breaking apart as station security forces finally reacted in full force. But even in that confusion, danger still existed in unpredictable bursts. One attacker attempted to circle around the side, trying to use the crowded chamber layout as cover. Another moved toward a secondary position near the Envoy's blind side. It was no longer a direct push. It was fragmentation, pressure from multiple directions. The human adjusted instantly. He did not chase. He did not overextend. He repositioned. Every step he took was deliberate, cutting off angles before they fully developed. It was not brute force that defined his movement. It was awareness, a constant calculation of space, distance, and timing. The Envoy, still behind him, was watching more closely now than ever before. She had seen trained security teams before. She had seen coordinated defense drills, elite escorts, and advanced automated systems. But what she was witnessing now did not match any of those categories. This was not structured team defense. This was something far more personal. Adaptive survival. The chamber lights shifted again, flickering under stress from system overrides and emergency protocols activating simultaneously. The environment itself felt unstable now, as if the station was struggling to decide whether it was a diplomatic space or a battlefield containment zone. Security teams finally reached full engagement. Station guards moved in organized formations, cutting off access points, isolating attackers, and securing civilian delegates. Communication channels filled with rapid status updates, overlapping commands, and location reports. But even with their arrival, the human remained central to the Envoy's immediate safety, because he was already inside the problem, not reacting to it from a distance. One of the attackers managed to slip through a momentary gap in security coverage and moved toward the Envoy again. It was fast, direct, and calculated. This time, the Envoy saw it clearly. She did not have time to fully process fear. The human moved first. He stepped sideways, intercepting the path with perfect timing. There was no hesitation, no visible planning delay. It was immediate correction. The attacker's forward motion was redirected without allowing contact to reach its intended target. The Envoy realized something in that moment. He was not reacting after seeing danger. He was already moving before danger fully formed. That was not normal training behavior. That was anticipation built from experience in environments where delay meant failure. The attacker stumbled off course, losing momentum. Security forces quickly moved in to contain them. The chamber was now fully active with coordinated response efforts. Yet despite all of that, the human remained focused on one thing only. Her position. Always her position. He adjusted again, placing himself slightly ahead and to the side, maintaining a protective barrier that shifted with every movement in the room. The Envoy finally spoke, her voice quieter now, but sharper with realization. "How many are there?" she asked. The human did not look away from the ongoing movement in the chamber. "Unknown," he replied. His tone was calm, but not uncertain. The difference mattered. The Envoy studied him more closely now. There was no panic in his movements, no escalation of emotion. Even as the situation intensified, he remained controlled in a way that felt unnatural to most observers. Another attacker attempted a sudden movement toward an elevated platform, possibly aiming for station control access. Security forces intercepted quickly, but not before the human tracked the movement with a brief shift in gaze. He was not only protecting the Envoy, he was tracking the structure of the entire engagement. That realization struck the Envoy more deeply than the attack itself, because it meant he was not simply reacting to immediate danger. He was analyzing the entire room as a system under stress, a system breaking into patterns. One of the station officers approached the Envoy's position briefly, shouting over the noise. "Stay in protected zone," the officer called. But before the Envoy could move, the human subtly blocked her forward motion with his positioning, not forcefully but decisively. It was a controlled barrier, not physical restraint. She understood immediately. He was not allowing movement because the safest position had not yet been confirmed. That level of control was not typical escort protocol. It was situational dominance awareness. The Envoy began to realize something unsettling. The station security response was strong, but still reactive. The human response was different. It was predictive. As the chamber conflict stabilized slightly, more attackers were contained by security teams. The situation was shifting from uncontrolled breach to partial containment. But even as order began returning, the human remained in full readiness. His posture did not drop. His scanning did not stop. Because in his experience, the end of visible chaos was often where secondary threats emerged. And he was right. A final, unexpected movement occurred near one of the sealed side corridors. A small access panel was forced open from the inside, and a lone figure attempted to slip through toward a maintenance route that could bypass security containment. Most of the room did not notice immediately, but the human did. His head turned instantly, not toward the crowd, toward the route. And in the same motion, he shifted his position again, placing himself directly between that path and the Envoy. The Envoy followed his line of sight this time and finally saw the movement. Security forces reacted seconds later, moving to intercept the final breach attempt. The situation was quickly contained, the access point sealed, and backup systems activated. Only then did the room begin to stabilize. The noise level dropped gradually. Commands became less urgent. Movement slowed. The immediate threat phase was ending. But the human did not relax. Even as security teams secured the chamber and confirmed containment, he remained in protective stance, scanning for confirmation rather than assumption. The Envoy noticed his breathing for the first time. It had not changed since the beginning. Still steady, still controlled, as if the entire event had not yet reached his limit of stress response. The armored delegate who had earlier questioned the situation now stood in silence, watching the aftermath unfold. Many others in the chamber were also silent, processing what had just happened. What had begun as a diplomatic session had turned into a live security crisis. And the human bodyguard had been at the center of the immediate response. Not because he was the strongest in the room, not because he had the most advanced equipment, but because he had acted the fastest when uncertainty turned into reality. The Envoy slowly turned her gaze forward again, looking at him more directly now. For the first time, she was not evaluating him as an assigned escort. She was trying to understand him as something else entirely. A question formed in her mind, but she did not ask it yet, because the answer was not something spoken during active containment protocols. Outside the chamber, emergency systems continued running. Internal station alerts confirmed partial stabilization. Security teams reported full control over most breach points. But inside the Envoy's mind, a different realization was forming. What she had just witnessed was not a random act of violence. It was a test of response systems. And in that test, the human had not just reacted. He had defined the outcome inside the room where every second mattered. As the final attacker was secured and the chamber doors began slowly sealing again, the human finally shifted his stance slightly. Not relaxing, just resetting, as if preparing for what might come after the silence returned. And the Envoy, watching him carefully now, began to understand something she had not expected when she first arrived. The silence that followed the chaos was not peace. It was evaluation. And in that evaluation, one truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The human assigned to protect her was not chosen because danger was unlikely. He was chosen because someone, somewhere, knew danger was inevitable. The chamber was finally quiet again, but it was not the same kind of quiet as before. Before the breach, silence had meant formality, control, and expectation. Now it meant aftermath. It meant systems recovering, people processing what they had just seen, and security teams confirming that nothing else was hiding behind the surface comm. Emergency lights slowly returned to their normal setting. The sharp alerts faded into soft status tones. Doors that had been locked under containment protocol began to cycle open again, one layer at a time, as station systems confirmed stability. But nobody in the chamber truly relaxed. Not yet. The alien Envoy stood still in her position, her posture unchanged, but her mind no longer focused on negotiations or protocols. Her attention was fixed on the human standing just a few steps in front of her. He was no longer in active motion, but he was not at rest either. He stood like someone who had not finished evaluating the environment. His eyes still moved occasionally, slow and controlled, checking corners, scanning reflections, and tracking movement even when there was nothing obvious left to track. Security teams moved carefully through the chamber, confirming identities, securing restraints, and assisting injured personnel. Communication devices continued to buzz softly with updates from other parts of the station. But all of that felt distant now. The Envoy finally took a small step forward. It was not a command. It was not part of protocol. It was personal curiosity. The human noticed immediately. His head turned slightly toward her, acknowledging her movement without breaking his awareness of the room. "You can stand down," she said softly. It was the first time her voice had carried something closer to human tone rather than diplomatic formality. The human did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked around once more, confirming the chamber's condition. Only after that did he speak. "Not yet confirmed clear," he said. His voice was calm, controlled. No emotion of tension or pride. Just procedure. The envoy studied him for a long moment. Most guards, after an event like this, would show signs of adrenaline release. Some would speak more than necessary. Others would try to explain their actions or justify their performance. He did none of that. It was as if what had just happened was not something unusual to him. That thought stayed with her. As security personnel continued cleanup operations, a senior station officer approached the envoy and bowed slightly. "Apologies for the disruption," the officer said. "The situation is now under full control." The envoy nodded once, but her eyes did not leave the human. "What was the cause?" she asked. The officer hesitated briefly. "We are still analyzing the breach pattern," he replied. "It appears to be a coordinated infiltration attempt targeting the diplomatic chamber systems." The words confirmed what had already been clear during the chaos. This was not random. It had purpose. And that made everything more serious. The envoy finally turned fully toward the human now. "You were assigned here with full knowledge of this possibility," she said. It was not a question anymore. The human met her gaze briefly, then looked away again toward the chamber perimeter. "Yes," he replied simply. That single word carried more weight than it should have. Because it meant someone had expected this kind of event. Not hoped against it, expected it. The envoy felt a slow shift in her understanding. She had entered this station believing she was part of a diplomatic exchange, a structured meeting between interstellar representatives. But what had just happened suggested something deeper was operating beneath that surface. Something involving risk assessment that had never been disclosed to her fully. She stepped slightly closer to the human now, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "How often does something like this happen?" she asked. The human paused for a moment before answering. "Less often here," he said. "More often elsewhere." The envoy absorbed that carefully. Elsewhere. That implied experience beyond diplomatic stations. Beyond controlled environments. Beyond places where failure was tolerable. She looked at him more closely now. Not as a guard, but as someone shaped by environments where survival was not guaranteed. Around them, the chamber was slowly returning to order. Delegates were being guided out for medical checks or debriefing. Security drones moved along the ceiling rails, scanning for residual threats. Systems ran automated diagnostics on every entry point. But the human remained where he was, still positioned between her and the main access routes. Even though the immediate threat was gone, the envoy finally spoke again. "You acted without hesitation," she said. "Even when others were still processing information." The human gave a slight nod, but did not elaborate. The envoy continued. "Was that training?" This time there was a pause before he answered. "Experience," he said. That word felt heavier than the others. Experience implied repetition. Exposure. Situations that had shaped response beyond instruction. The envoy slowly began to understand something she had not considered before arriving at this station. Humans were not just participants in diplomacy. They were shaped by environments that others in the chamber could not fully comprehend. She turned slightly, glancing at the damaged chamber doors, now being repaired by station systems. The marks of forced entry were already being analyzed and recorded for review. Then she looked back at him. "You were calm," she said, "even during active breach." The human's eyes shifted briefly toward her, then away again. "Calm is required when environment changes faster than planning," he said. The envoy repeated the thought silently in her mind. Environment changes faster than planning. That was not just a tactical statement. It was a philosophy built from survival pressure. She felt something shift in her perspective again. Before this moment, she had seen him as assigned protection. Now she was beginning to see him as something shaped by conditions that most species in this sector never experienced directly. A station officer approached again, this time addressing both of them. The chamber will remain under controlled access for review, the officer said. You are both requested to proceed to secure briefing area. The envoy nodded. The human gave a short acknowledgement. As they began walking together, the envoy noticed something subtle again. Even in movement, he did not fully relax. His position relative to her adjusted continuously, maintaining coverage angles without drawing attention. When they passed intersections, he slowed slightly until sightlines were confirmed. When they entered wider corridors, he adjusted distance to maintain protective spacing. It was not random behavior. It was constant environmental mapping. After a few moments of silence, the envoy spoke again. You are not from a standard planetary environment, she said. The human did not immediately answer. After a short pause, he replied, No. That single word confirmed something she had only been suspecting until now. She studied him for a moment longer. Deathworld designation? She asked carefully. The human did not react to the term. Yes, he said. The envoy let that settle. Deathworlds were not common in diplomatic discussions unless discussing resource classification or survival adaptation studies. They were worlds where natural conditions themselves were hostile to long-term survival of unprotected life forms. If he was from such an environment, then everything she had seen made more sense. But it also raised more questions. How did you adapt to this role? She asked. The human looked forward as they walked. I did not adapt to the role, he said. The role was built around what I already was trained to do. The envoy processed that carefully. It suggested something important. He had not been shaped by diplomatic security training alone. He had been selected because his baseline behavior already matched extreme survival requirements. They reached a secured corridor leading toward a briefing area. Doors opened automatically as they approached, recognizing authorized movement. Before entering, the envoy stopped briefly and turned toward him. You were not chosen randomly, she said. The human did not respond immediately. Then he spoke. No one here is random. The envoy held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she entered the briefing corridor. But her mind did not follow protocol anymore. It stayed behind in the chamber they had just left. Because something had changed in a way she could not ignore. The silence after the attack was gone. And in its place was something far more unsettling. Understanding, not of the event itself, but of the human standing at the center of it. And for the first time since arriving at the station, the envoy realized the truth was not about what had just been prevented. It was about what kind of world creates someone who can prevent it so calmly.